Hello and welcome back once again. This is our final video lesson for 1.6 Kingdom Plantae, and in this video, we will be looking at the most familiar and most colorful of the groups. We're going to be looking at flowering plants in group Angiosperms. If you're ready, let's get started. As usual, we'll begin the lesson with looking at the learning objectives. I hope that by the end of this lesson, you will be able to describe the unique characteristics of angiosperms, which is phylum Entophyta, and also talk about the evolutionary relationship in kingdom Plantae. Now, I would like you to think of all the flowering plants that you've ever thought of, from grass to roses to trees, and try to associate them with the unique characteristics that we'll learn about shortly. Okay, you have the mental image of your plants ready? Let's continue. The first unique characteristic of angiosperms that we'll talk about here is the dominant generation. Dominant generation of angiosperms is the sporophyte, and the gametophyte generation is reduced, which is microscopic in size, and they depend on the sporophyte for nutrients. The gametophytes in angiosperms are the pollen grain and the embryo sac. So you see here, that's the sporophyte, and those little pollen are the gametophyte generation. The next unique characteristic of angiosperms will be about its fertilization. Angiosperms do not require water for fertilization. Because the sperms are non-motile, there is a pollen tube to help sperm cell to reach the egg cell. And another thing that you should remember about angiosperms is that they are heterosporous. So all angiosperms will produce two types of spores, which is the microspore and the megaspore. The microspore is the male one, which is the pollen grain, and the megaspore will be the female one, which is the embryo sac. Talking about the pollen grain and also the embryo sac, that brings us to the next unique characteristic of angiosperms, which is angiosperms undergo double fertilization. Double fertilization is something that is unique to only angiosperms, and it contributes to a lot to their survival and their success in this ecosystem. After double fertilization in angiosperms, the ovary will develop into fruit, the ovule will develop into seed, the seed will consist of a diploid embryo, and the seed will be enclosed by the seed coat, which is derived from the integuments of the ovule, and the fruit will protect the seed and aid in its dispersal. Before it's ready, like when it's still on the tree, of course the fruit itself is going to protect the seed, and when something like us, humans or other mammals, when we pick up the fruit and we eat the fruit and we throw the fruits and the seeds, that will cause the seed to grow wherever it is thrown. So that is how the fruit protect the seed and also aid in its dispersal. And we're still on the topic of sexual reproduction, so we'll talk about the sexual reproductive structure of angiosperms, which is the flower. The flowers are usually bright in colors, they're scented, and they often offer pollen or nectar as food. The pollination of angiosperms is done by several agents, and these are usually insects or other animals instead of wind. I think there are still some species of angiosperms that are pollinated by wind, but most of them is pollinated by animals. That is it for the unique characteristics of angiosperms. Now we'll move on to its classification. So group angiosperms, we usually only look at it as one phylum, which is phylum Entophyta, flowering plants. And phylum Entophyta can be classified into two classes. Okay, ingat, phylum adalah classification di atas, taxonomy di bawah dia adalah class. Two classes, which is class Dicotyledonnae. Usual example, okay, the example I give you here is the mango plant or Mangifera indica. Another class is class Monocotyledonnae or Monocots. Over here we have the corn, or the scientific name of corn is Z. maize. Okay, so I'm sure you have learned about dicotyledons and monocotyledons when you were in school, but I'm just going to do a comparison between them just to refresh your memory. Okay, let's start with the comparison by looking at the seed itself. Inside the seed, you will have the embryo. In monocots, the embryo will have only one cotyledon, and in dicots, the embryo will have two cotyledons, which is how we came up with the name for the classes. In class monocotyledon, the leaves will have parallel venation. Okay, so dia memang begini, dia tidak akan bertembung dengan jalur lain. Venation is, you can say, is the corak pada daun itu. Okay, kalau kamu ambil daun, kamu coba tengok. And for class Dicotyledonnae, the leaves will have a reticulate or net-like venation. So go ahead, pick up a leaf and go see if it has parallel venation or net-like venation. Another aspect that we're going to compare is talking about the xylem and the phloem's arrangement. So if you cut the stem and you're looking at the xylem and the phloem inside, in monocots, you will see scattered vascular bundles in the stem. It will not have a vascular cambium. So vascular cambium is absent, no secondary growth. Dan kamu tengok di sini, kamu boleh nampak xylem dengan phloem dia akan berterabur lah. Phloem dia biasanya akan tersusun di tepi, xylem dia akan tersusun di tengah, tapi dia macam berselerak sedikit. In dicotyledons, there is a ring of vascular bundles in the stem. Okay, you can see here, it's arranged very, very neatly. The line that you see here, nampak macam garisan merah ini, adalah dia punya vascular cambium. So the vascular cambium is usually present. It will give rise to secondary growth. This is something that we covered briefly in chapter 2 in the previous semester. Okay, so that is the vascular cambium. On the inside is the xylem. On the outside is the phloem. Okay, so you can see this difference between monocots and dicots. Another comparison that we can do is that monocots will have a fibrous root system. So ini adalah akar serabut. Whereas for dicots, they will have a taproot system, yaitu akar tunjang. Okay, so you can see from the shape here, it is different in its morphology. And last but not least, we can also compare the structure of the flowers for monocots and dicots. Monocots petals are usually in multiples of 3. So kalau ini 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is multiple of 3. Whereas in dicots, the petals are usually in multiples of 4 or 5. So you will see in this one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So there are 10 petals here. Okay, so that is another comparison that you can do between monocots and dicots. Okay, so that is it that we need to memorize for angiosperms. This next part of the video is quite different in that we're going to compare across these 4 groups of plants and look at the evolutionary relationship. We need to be able to explain the evolutionary relationships among groups in Kingdom Plantae from bryophytes to angiosperms. Apa yang kita akan buat actually? Kita banding 4 grup nih. Dan yang paling simple adalah grup yang paling mirip tumbuhan pertama yang tumbuh di daratan. Okay, it's going to be most similar to the very first land plants, billions of years ago. Whereas the group that is most complicated, yang paling rumit dia punya design, macam banyak kena tambah-tambah, itu adalah grup yang paling kebelakangan ni dia baru evolve. Okay, it is most recently evolved and you can consider them as modern plants. So they are the most different from the very first land plants that came onto Earth. Okay, yang paling rumit itu adalah yang paling lambat evolusi dia, paling recent, okay, paling baru, dan dia paling berbeza dengan tumbuhan yang pertama hidup di daratan billion tahun dahulu. Okay, so if you don't understand the concept completely, that's okay, as long as you try to follow along with the comparison that I'm going to do. So let's get started. We're going to compare in from several perspectives. Kita akan tengok dari beberapa perspektif ataupun beberapa criteria. The first criteria that we're going to look at is the size of the plants. So among these four groups, bryophytes are the smallest in size. So they're very small. If you're standing, you could stand right on top of them. Whereas for group pteridophytes, they are large in size compared with the bryophytes. For groups gymnosperm and angiosperm, they are the largest size when it's compared with bryophytes and pteridophytes. Ada yang renek, tapi kebanyakan daripada mereka adalah tumbuhan yang keras, so they are woody plants and they can grow very, very tall. So something that contributes to the size of the plants is whether or not they have true root stems or leaves. Bryophytes do not have true roots, stems, or leaves, whereas pteridophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms do have true roots, stems, and leaves. Okay, so that is for the size of plants. Let's move on to the next criteria. The next criteria that we're looking at is the size of the gametophyte. In bryophytes and pteridophytes, the gametophytes are macroscopic, which means we can see them with our naked eyes without using any microscopes. So this is an example gametophyte of a bryophyte. Over here, example gametophyte of pteridophytes. In gymnosperms and angiosperms, the gametophytes are microscopic, which is they're so small we need a microscope to see. So this is example of gametophyte of gymnosperm, example of gametophyte of angiosperms. Let's continue with the third criteria that we'll look at. Now we're looking at the presence of vascular tissues in these four groups. In bryophytes, bryophytes are non-vascular plants, so they have the absence of vascular tissues. Pteridophytes are vascular plants. They have simple lignified vascular tissue, and gymnosperms and angiosperms are true vascular plants in that they have the presence of complex and lignified vascular tissues. Again, this is related to whether or not they have true roots, stems, and leaves. Just a very quick overview. Bryophytes, not vascular tissue, not vascular plant. Pteridophytes, yes, is a vascular plant, but simple vascular tissues. Gymnosperms and angiosperms are vascular plants with real complex vascular tissues. Okay, and then that is it. We're moving on to criteria number 4. Criteria number 4 is looking at the dominance of gametophyte and sporophytes. So bryophytes, dominant generation is gametophyte. For pteridophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms, the dominant generation is its sporophyte. So this one is quite simple, and I'm going to move on to the next criteria, where we talk about the dependence of gametophyte and sporophyte. Siapa yang bergantung kepada siapa? In group bryophytes, the sporophytes depend on the gametophytes in obtaining nutrients. And the gametophyte is free-living and they carry out photosynthesis. So this is example of bryophyte. Gametophyte is down here, sporophyte is up here. Sporophyte depend on gametophyte for nutrients. Gametophyte supports sporophyte. In pteridophytes, the gametophyte is independent, which is free-living, and it will carry out its own photosynthesis. So over here, we have that gametophyte of Dryopteris species, and you can see the sporophyte is growing out of the gametophyte. Young sporophyte depend on gametophyte, but mature sporophyte is independent. Okay, so the gametophyte supports young sporophyte. Moving on with gymnosperms and angiosperms. In both of these groups, gametophytes depend on the sporophytes in obtaining nutrients, and the gametophyte is surrounded and protected by the tissue of the sporophyte. So in gymnosperm, again, sporophytes will protect and then support gametophytes. Angiosperms also, the sporophyte protects and supports the sporophytes. All right. The gametophytes, sorry. And then we're going on to the next criteria is criteria number 6, water dependence in fertilization. So when we talk about water dependence in fertilization, we mean, does it need water for sexual reproduction? For bryophytes and pteridophytes, water is needed because they have flagellated sperm, and the flagellated sperms are motile, they can swim, they need water to swim. For group Gymnosperms and Angiosperms, water is not needed because the sperm cells are non-motile. That should be fairly straightforward, and we're moving on to the very last criteria, which is embryo protection. In bryophytes and pteridophytes, who will protect the embryo? It is the female gametophyte or archegonium. So the female parts of the gametophyte, in this case, it's this yellow bit, and this is the sporophyte growing out of the female gametophyte. They will protect the developing and growing embryo. Whereas in gymnosperms and angiosperms, sporophyte, the whole plant, will protect the embryo from drought, desiccation, and harmful UV radiation. So in the case of gymnosperms, the whole plant will protect the sporophyte that is inside the cones. Whereas in angiosperms, the whole plant, including the fruit, will protect the embryo and the spore and whatever is inside there. Okay, so that is the difference in embryo protection between these 4 groups. The comparison that I gave you just now can also be summarized in this table. This table, you can take your time to read it. You have to remember some of the points, okay? Try to remember the 7 criteria that I went through with you earlier. And if you have any doubts, if you have any problems you don't quite understand, please feel free to ask questions. So that's the end of this subtopic. What should you do now? Come up with your own notes for this and then answer Google Form quiz for 1.6 Kingdom Plantae. And finally, try to answer the tutorial questions for Chapter 1, Part B, Question 3, and we will discuss that in the next lesson. That's pretty much it from me. Thank you very much for your time and your attention, and I will see you again soon. Thank you, and happy learning. Bye!